Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review, where we will be looking back at the last several articles I have written for founderoftheday.com and videos I've published here on Founder of the Day on YouTube. Jesse White, thank you so much for coming. Hi. Everyone else, thank you for showing up as you roll in. Now, people do roll in a little bit slowly. Just a brief overview. Usually, this is a discussion of 7 American founders, but I was on vacation last week, and I have missed a whole bunch. So I'm actually going to wrap up the last 2 weeks. We're going to see if we can still keep it to an hour. I'll talk really fast and pack it in. But just kidding. If you guys have questions, I am happy to answer them, of course. That being said, I also had a power outage last week. So while 2 weeks should be 14 founders, we were only doing 13 because I could not actually publish anything. Theoretically, I could have done it on my phone, but that makes me very nervous. So 13 founders should be enough for this week. I appreciate your patience. I am back. We are going live today. We are going to have trivia super live tomorrow. Tomorrow is technically Independence Day, July 2nd, the day they voted for independence. So very fun times around here. I got a few special surprises for there. I'm also probably going to do a live stream, wink, wink, that I'll announce tomorrow on Sunday is 4th of July. So, these founders I have put out brief videos on in the last 2 weeks. If you have any questions as we go, please let me know. And let's get started. So, I do want to note, I usually do start with the Anti-Federalist paper that I do every Friday. That being said, there were 2 of them over the last 2 weeks, so I'm going to do Federalist 1 and 2 right now. I'm sorry, Federal Farmer 1 and 2 right now. And then we'll just carry on with founders the rest of the time instead of halfway through doing another Federal Farmer. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. So why don't we pop it up here? And I'm sticking with this screen this week. So Federal Farmer number 1. The Federal Farmers are by far the longest anti-federalist papers I've read so far. There is a lot to them, so we're going to make this super brief. Federal Farmer number 1 is, as you might expect, kind of outlining what the Federal Farmer is going to be discussing. Again, these were published in New York just in the weeks after the Constitution was signed. It was signed in Philadelphia on September 17th, and by October 8th, they have published 5 lengthy essays about this. Hi, TJ. Thanks for coming. Just got here in time. As I had mentioned earlier, we're about to cover 2 weeks because I was on vacation last week. So, Federal Farmer number 1, lots of complaints. Basically just saying, hey, why, what's the rush here? You know, it took a whole summer for you to write the United States Constitution. Why do we have to ratify it so quickly? Can't we take a look? Can we take our time and digest what's going on here? So in the first Federal Farmer, the anonymous anti-federalist Arthur, who is probably Melanchthon Smith, mostly complaining about the haste, but he also talks about how suspicious he is of certain characters involved in the American Revolution. Goes out of his way to make sure it's not George Washington he's talking about, but, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, these young men, barely even 30, come together and somehow sneak this Constitution through. He doesn't call them out by name, but he does, and I should have a quote down here somewhere, he talks about Pennsylvania and Virginia, how specifically Pennsylvania, quote, appointed principally those men who are esteemed aristocratical. He also, he uses a lot of language that makes it seem like he does not care for certain people who were at the Constitutional Convention and believe that they were essentially trying to throw a coup and assume power of the United States. It is the most, how do I say, aggressive language I've read in any anti-federalist paper. He is really on the line of getting called out for a duel. Good thing it's anonymous. But that's the gist of the first one. Now, we will pop over here to Federal Farmer number 2. It's a little bit brighter. Sorry about that. Federal Farmer number 2, he starts going into a little more detail on some of his complaints. First of all, he talks about the distance is important. Not only the distance of wherever the capital will end up, which he assumes at that point, it hadn't been decided it was Washington, D.C. yet. So he assumes it's going to be somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, which puts the capital at a much greater distance from the people themselves than they were in their respective states. And the further you are from, the mid-Atlantic, the further north or south you go, the further you are removed from the government, and therefore the more difficult it would be for you to participate in the government. Additionally, as we've heard in other anti-federalist papers, he talks about how, right at the time he wrote it, there were 13 state governments, and they had about 2,000 people in their respective assemblies. But under the United States, 200 senators and closer to 2,000 assemblymen. But as the United States comes together, well, there's just 26 senators in the first United States Senate. That's a lot less people, a lot less representatives that are a lot harder to contact. Furthermore, he talks about federal courts. And we are going to get, tomorrow I will be publishing about the third federal farmer, which he goes into a lot more detail on that one, onto the court system. But he just, first of all, there's so much power installed in these federal courts, and a federal court system would be a smaller system than that of the separate states, and therefore would be a lot harder for people to file grievances and settle lawsuits when the justices themselves are so much more difficult to rein in. Though I will say, Federal Farmer does note that he doesn't want it to be that easy to sue people. He doesn't want it to get out of hand. It should be a little bit of work. If you have really been wronged in a fashion, then you really should have to go out of your way to prove it and make it happen. But still, not acceptable. He also then discusses the Bill of Rights. There's no Bill of Rights when the Constitution is first published, so he is among many people upset with that, as many anti-federalists are. That would get remedied. That is one of the major things the anti-federalists complain about, is of no Bill of Rights, and that's why we call the first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights, when truthfully they're just amendments to the Constitution to give people those rights. The major complaint. Lastly, he talks about force. He talks about, because there's this great distance, that the people either will not feel attached to the federal government, or they will not like the federal government, and it will either lead to people neglecting it or purposefully ignoring the Constitution or accidentally ignoring it. And either way, there will have to be the use of force, which the government is conveniently granted, to force people to obey the federal government. And there's another quote I have here. Quote, neglected laws or a military execution of them must lead to a revolution and to the destruction of freedom, which is eerily predicts the Civil War in a fashion. Though you find a lot of anti-federalists eerily predicting the Civil War. I do also want to note there is a quote from the first one I forgot to mention, which really encapsulates the federal farmer's main essence of his grievance, which is, instead of being 13 republics under a federal head, it is clearly designed to make us one consolidated government. And the federal farmer, as compared to many other anti-federalists had the same basis of argument, but the real concern of federal farmer, the real gist of it, is a fear of consolidation. The federal farmer really believed that the United States federal government was a national government and would eventually make the state governments obsolete and therefore assume them, essentially. Make what you will of that. We don't talk about modern politics here. But with that, we've gotten through the federal farmer. Now we have 13 minus 2 is 11 American founders to get through. So I'm going to take a quick sip of my coffee here because we got a long night ahead of us. And we're going to talk about Theophilus Parsons. Let me know. Leave me a comment. How do you love that name? Theophilus, I think, is an amazing name. There were some great names back then. So Theo over here. Theophilus was from Massachusetts, and he starts the Essex Junto, as it says next to me. And we're going to get to that in a second. But the Essex Junto becomes really the hardcore wing of the Federalist Party a few decades after he starts it. Now, Parsons is from Essex, the region of Massachusetts, and he really starts to come to prominence after the independence had been declared. All the separate states went and created separate state governments. Massachusetts was among these. Now, what's really important to know about Massachusetts and its writing of its first constitution is its first constitution in 1778 was rejected by the people because it was too democratic. And Theophilus Parsons is one of the people who came to prominence at this time in Massachusetts, fighting against this democratic Massachusetts government, and successfully so. The first constitution that was proposed to Massachusetts did not happen. Parsons, having made a name for himself, then goes over and helps write the second version of Massachusetts' first constitution, and this one's ratified in 1780. And I want a side note here. It's really interesting. He, as with many of the people who did not like that first constitution, they wrote this second one because it was too democratic. As I said, they wanted the elites to be in charge, but they accidentally wrote some things in there that said all men, I don't remember the quote, it's not all men are created equal, but something along those lines in the Massachusetts government, all men are free and equal under the Massachusetts government. And it was this that a few years later you have Theodore Sedgwick with several enslaved people, including Mumbet. Elizabeth Freeman is her anglicized name. They sue Massachusetts for freedom, saying, hey, that constitution that Theophilus Parsons helped write in 1780, hey, didn't that liberate us? And yes, the end result is this second constitution they wrote outlawed slavery in Massachusetts, but it took them about 4 years to realize slavery had already been outlawed. It's a little funny in hindsight, but it's also a really exciting moment in American history. But as for Parsons, now, he at this time started what became known as the Essex Junto. The people from Essex, Massachusetts were a bunch of people who wanted a strong state government run by elites. So when Alexander Hamilton comes back with this constitution and starts building this Treasury Department a decade later, Parsons is really happy about it. His Essex Junto starts to include people like Timothy Pickering, who we've discussed a lot here lately, especially with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky when she came on a few times. And Pickering ends up being essentially Hamilton's man in the Washington and then John Adams administration, and they become the real radical part of the Massachusetts government. Now, of the national government. Now, Parsons never serves on the national stage other than going to the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution Ratification Convention in Massachusetts, where he votes for the Constitution as a Federalist. He ends up, his prominent role is he becomes Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, just about the time John Adams is leaving the presidency and Jefferson's assuming it. But again, it was this little junto that he started that became the core of the Federalist Party. Granted, a few decades later, the Essex Junto are the ones associated with the Hartford Convention, which doesn't look good to a lot of people because they are accused of wanting to leave the Union because little Jemmy Madison's War of 1812 was not something they were big fans of. But that's Theophilus Parsons. He's a very low-level player in the American founding, but he started this little club in the late 1770s that in the late 1790s, 20 years later, was arguably the most important little club in the country because it was that little club that was the radical wing of the Federalist Party, and essentially the ones who steered John Adams in certain directions that history didn't love. It was the Essex Junto that pushed him towards the Alien and Sedition Acts, for example, and certain new taxes. Now, again, I don't want to take the blame from President Adams for making those decisions, but he relied on advisors that he inherited from George Washington, and in an effort to unify the country, he listens to the Essex Junto. So that is Theophilus Parsons. Hey, Nick, you're here just in time. We got a lot of founders. I'm making up. I missed last week. Hey, Colonel, thank you for coming. I missed last week because I was on a little jaunt to visit some family, so we're doubling up on the American founders this week. We're going to pop over to Benjamin Stoddard. Speaking of John Adams's cabinet, thank you for the like. If you guys want to hit like, that's the best thing you can do in the whole world. As you can see next to me, he's the first Secretary of the Navy, but he was John Adams's Secretary of the Navy. Hold on, let's go back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about his life. And again, we're recapping the videos I put out in the last 2 weeks, so if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. You can see short versions of this all over my website. So he was a merchant who had made a good amount of money. He was from I believe, I want to say Maryland. Might be Delaware. I apologize. Don't remember exactly which state he was from. But he joins the Revolutionary War. He becomes a captain of cavalry. He's injured at the Battle of Brandywine, and unfortunately does have to withdraw from military life. But he is injured in the Revolutionary War itself. However, he gets a desk job. And that desk job is with the Board of War. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Board of War when we get to Mifflin a little bit later today. But essentially, the Board of War was created because the Continental Congress couldn't keep up with everything that was going on at once. And the Board of War was created as kind of a mediary to be. First, it was members of the Continental Congress, but then it was private citizens who were to oversee the war effort. Essentially, George Washington's bosses. Uh, Again, it gets controversial, but Stoddard is hired as secretary of the Board of War. And as secretary, he's the one communicating between George Washington and the Continental Congress. He's the go-to, keeping everything together. And he stays in this position until the victory at Yorktown. After this, he goes back to his private life for a few years, the 1780s, good to him. And then George Washington becomes president a decade later. And when Washington is president, they decide to make a capital somewhere. And they decide to make a capital in what we now know as Washington, D.C. But they didn't tell anyone that they were doing that. Instead, Washington quietly hires Stoddard and his partner, Uriah Forrest, to make the purchases of the land. Now, if you went out and said, hey, can we buy your land? We want to start the United States Capitol here. Well, that person's going to sell you that land at a very high price, taking advantage of a government contractor. We don't talk about modern politics here, but you see what I'm getting at. Stoddard goes he buys this land pretty secretly and literally purchases Washington, D.C. He doesn't, it's not like he buys it and sells it. He buys it with government money for the government. He just does it very quietly. One of the early shady things the United States government did. Thanks, George Washington. Anyway, to be fair, that means that the U.S. taxpayer gets a good deal on the land that becomes Washington, D.C. Now, Stoddard goes back to private life for almost another decade. And it isn't until John Adams is president in 1798 when the quasi-war with France begins. And Adams realizes, hey, this is a ocean-going war. The quasi-war didn't have, I don't believe, any land battles. It was all just Navy ships. But you know what you need? A Navy. Now, the Americans did have a little bit of a Navy, but they didn't have a Secretary of the Navy. Where's my finger? There it is. A Secretary of the Navy. I'll do it on this side. Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddard, was available. And John Adams contacts him and makes him the first Secretary of the Navy. Please note, George Washington did not ever have a Secretary of the Navy. He had a Secretary of War, which encompassed the Navy, but during a time of war when ships at sea was the main way wars were fought, Adams probably rightly chose to create the position. And he chose Benjamin Stoddard because as a longtime merchantman, he knew how to oversee ships at sea while he was on land. He had all the experience from the Revolutionary War as a secretary of the Board of War, corresponding and administrating a war. And he was a great choice. And it's interesting because, as I said before, with Theophilus Parsons, the Essex Junto, Timothy Pickering, and to maybe a lesser degree, James McHenry, were kind of being sneaky and taking orders from Hamilton. Even though Hamilton wasn't in office, John Adams was president. Benjamin Stoddard, as the one guy that Adams brought in as his own guy, really became Adams' number two in a fashion. I mean, remember, his vice president, Jefferson, by this point, had kind of turned his back on him. So this guy really is the second most powerful person after John Adams during the Adams administration, especially during wartime. Yes, Benjamin Stoddard. Is there anything else on him? Oh, yes. While he's leading the Navy, he starts the Navy Department Library. And this is kind of a side note. Doesn't have a lot to do with the Revolution. He just started it. But that Navy Department Library still exists and has a vast amount of readers, or not readers, content, for lack of a better term. And therefore, he started one of the most important Navy and anything Marine libraries in the world. So that's a fun fact about Benjamin Stoddard. Again, I'm happy to answer questions if you have any as we pour through here. We got a whole bunch to get through today. I'll take a quick sip of coffee to get me going. And then we're going to talk about John Thomas. John Thomas fortified the heights. So when the American Revolutionary War breaks out, John Thomas was one of those experienced officers of war who led his men to Boston. My understanding is he missed Lexington and Concord. Many people did. But even though he didn't lead Minutemen, he ran right over. And then starts to, siege Boston, as they did. When the Continental Army appoints George Washington as president, they appoint a bunch of major generals, and they appoint a bunch of brigadier generals. Now, the first major general appointed was Artemas Ward. And rightfully so, because when Lexington and Concord happens and the siege of Boston begins, and this army of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut men just kind of come together, Artemas Ward falls into the position of leading them. He is, there is an argument to be made that Joseph Warren was leading everything until George Washington showed up, or until he died a few days before George Washington showed up. But Artemas Ward was essentially the general in charge. So when the Continental Army names major generals, they make Artemas Ward the top, numero uno major general. But they also wanted to be cautious and name, they wanted to name major generals in ranking order from different colonies at that time, because they didn't want to make people upset. They didn't want everyone to say, well, why does Massachusetts and Virginia get all the generals? Even though the answer would be, they have most of the best men. But he was left out. Instead, there were other gentlemen, off the top of my head, Israel Putnam from Connecticut, who was himself an experienced officer, but John Thomas had led him in previous wars, in the war, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. So Thomas saw men he had led be promoted over him in his eyes. Now again, the argument was, we can't just do Massachusetts guys. We need to bring in Israel Putnam from Connecticut and generals from other places. So Thomas resigns. And no one really cares for this. So George Washington contacts him directly and says, come on, man, we need your help. And actually Charles Lee contacts him, which is interesting because Lee's character is questionable throughout the war. We're not going to get into that. But Charles Lee writes him and says, listen, I outranked George Washington and Artemas Ward. And here I am, technically number 2 or 3. Can't remember if he was above or below Philip Schuyler, who he also outranked, theoretically. But this is how things were playing out, and we should play by the rules. And they are actually able to convince Thomas to return and be a brigadier general, and it's sure a good thing they did. Because once Henry Knox makes his famous train, where he takes the artillery and the cannons from Ticonderoga and takes them through the snow all the way to Massachusetts, famously, they use those cannons to kick the British out of Boston. But not so famously is John Thomas is the one who's put in charge of fortifying Dorchester Heights. Now, Massachusetts, as I've said repeatedly on this channel, looks different now than it did back then. They have filled in a lot of Massachusetts Bay to make it not such a peninsula as it was. But at the time, Massachusetts was almost an island with this little strip of land going to the mainland. And what Thomas was able to do is, in just one night, with the help of many others, I should note, 2,000 men he led in the darkness. They quietly built fortifications and dragged the cannons up to the heights on Dorchester Heights, across the water. So when the British woke up that day, they were staring at cannons that could easily shoot down at them, but if they shot up with their old-timey guns, those balls would not make it. And that is really what drives the British to evacuate Boston. We have John Thomas to thank for that. Now, sadly for Thomas, happily for Thomas, he's almost immediately given that major general he wanted. Sadly for him, they sent him up to Canada, where the invasion of Canada has turned very poorly. Things went well in Massachusetts, but the Battle of Quebec went very poorly. We will talk about that a little bit later too. And they are evacuating, and the men go to Montreal, and Thomas goes up there. Now, one of the reasons Thomas was such a good leader during all of his life is because he wasn't above the other men. At a time where your level of society mattered, and many generals stayed in houses when their men camped out in the tents, John Thomas mixed with his men, so to speak. This is why they loved him. They would shake hands, but he would go in, he would camp with them. He was very much one of the men. Now, there was a smallpox outbreak. And when there's a smallpox outbreak, you don't want to be mixing with the people who have smallpox. Now, in his defense, Thomas did actually split the men who had smallpox away from the men who didn't, and quarantine them, which is something we're accustomed to today, but was, I don't want to say revolutionary at the time, but a very good move. Unfortunately for him, he was one of those men that caught smallpox, and he was one of those men that died on June 2nd, 1776. So before independence even happened, this man, who was a hero of Boston, passes away, and we move on to another founder. If you guys want to hit like while we're doing that, that'd be great. I'm going to take a sip of water this time, getting a little thirsty, because we are doubling up. For anyone tuning in late, I did not do this last week, so I'm covering 2 weeks worth of founders. So lots of good times, happy fun for all of us. And we are going to talk about some myths and stories. Jonathan Moulton is an amazing character. One sec. Drinking water out of my Liberty & Co cup. Liberty & Co, best products in the American Revolution industry. Jonathan Moulton, of all the American founders I've discussed, has more myths and legends surrounding his name than anyone else I've come across. Let's just say, you catching up, TJ? I'm not sure where I lost you, but come on, catch up. What he did during the war, he was already a successful merchant on the New Hampshire frontier. He had fought in King George's War and the French and Indian War, just like John Thomas we discussed before. During the Revolutionary War, he was made I believe it was a brigadier general in the New Hampshire militia. Now, in the New Hampshire militia, his role was to defend New Hampshire. So he did not, I'm catching, okay, thank you, DJ. He did not, you threw me off there. He didn't travel outside of New Hampshire much. In fact, his job was to patrol the 15 miles or so of coastline that New Hampshire has, to make sure the British didn't invade, especially the cities like Portsmouth, which is right on the water, and Exeter is not far off the water. None of the towns or cities of New Hampshire were very far from the water at the time, or today. They're still in the same place. And the British did raid every once in a while, especially early in the war. Notably in Maine, they had burned a few villages, and that was always a threat. I'm surprised they didn't do it more. So his job was to do that. Now, he doesn't see a lot of fighting, although he does lead his men to New York, or to, Vermont, or whatever they were calling it at the time, to participate in the Battle of Saratoga, or the Saratoga Campaign. But then he goes right back, and he spends all 8 years of the war helping there. And then he goes back to his successful frontier little, he was a trader. Not only did he trade in the furs that people were hunting out in the wilderness, but he would also sell them wares and goods. It's kind of a general goods store for a trading company thing going on. Now, after the war, he goes back to that, and, that's pretty much it. He serves in the assembly a few times. But his story is fascinating based on the legends. So let's cut back to before the Revolution. He had made a good deal of money with this little general goods store, and his neighbors were like, how did he make all that money? And why is his house white? You see, it was expensive to paint your house white, and he needed a lot of money to waste frivolously, as they saw it, on painting a house white. So they determined that he had to make a deal with the devil. I mean, honestly, what else could it be? It couldn't just be that he was, making money with his business. No way. So they determined that the deal he made with the devil was the devil said, I'll give you, I don't know what, they never really say what the devil got in return for the deal, but the devil basically said, I will fill up one of your boots with gold Ooh. So, to outsmart the devil, Jonathan Moulton cut a hole in the bottom of his boot and cut a hole in the bottom of his floor and put the boot on the floor, and the devil kept pouring in gold until he filled up the whole basement with gold. Now, no one ever saw this basement. This probably didn't happen, but everyone believed it because he has his house burned down very mysteriously. It could have been an accident, but it's indicated that his neighbors probably burned down his house. Was this because they were afraid of the devil? Maybe. Was this because they were jealous of his lavish spending? Maybe. We'll never know. But that's just the beginning of his story. So, just after the Revolutionary War starts, Moulton's spouse, Abigail, who survived the fire, dies. Sad. He, within a year, marries a much younger, very, very attractive woman named Sarah. Found it. It's here. His second wife's name is Sarah, and she's very attractive and very young. And then he gives Sarah the same wedding ring he had given Abigail. As the story goes, Abigail wakes up in the middle of the night, in the first night in their bed with that ring, and Sarah wakes up, and the ghost of Abigail is haunting the bedroom. Now, this legend doesn't appear until later. I should note, the devil deal, that happened during his life. This didn't happen until years and years later. There's a famous poet called John Greenleaf Whittier who actually wrote a poem about this particular haunting, which makes it even less likely that it happened. For those of you who believe in ghosts, you can believe it happened or not, but unfortunately that story comes from a long time later, probably about 50 years after the haunting. And so, again, questionable, but this is the legend of this gentleman. We're not done with Jonathan Moulton yet. The final tale of the three that we are discussing today is his funeral. So Jonathan Moulton dies, and as we discussed, his neighbors didn't care for him, so he actually asked to be buried in an unmarked grave, extra deep in the ground, to make sure his body isn't tampered with. So he's in a casket, and one of his pallbearers, the casket's closed, and they bring it to the funeral, and one of his pallbearers is a close friend of his, and he wants to get one last look at Jonathan before he's buried. So he opens the casket a little bit, and to his surprise, there's no cadaver. There's a bag. And he opens the bag and looks in the bag, and there's coins, gold coins. And the gold coins have the devil's face on them. Ooh, spooky. That's Jonathan Moulton, a brigadier general in the New Hampshire militia who protected the coasts from British invasion, who has the most freaky little legends about him of any American founder I have found. And now we're going to talk about another legend. I went with more legends this week. Johnny Appleseed. Moving right along. And if you have any questions, let me know. But we're going to talk about Johnny Appleseed. People are often surprised to know that Johnny Appleseed was a real person. His real last name was Chapman. His name was John Chapman. He was born in Massachusetts at the same time that Sam and John Adams and others were in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. So he's a little bit younger than many of the founders we discussed, but we all know the story of Johnny Appleseed. He just walks around, just throwing apple seeds around America, giving us apples, which is not wrong. John Chapman, for whatever reason, at the age of 18, decided to take to his feet and walk westward. So he first goes to Pennsylvania, where he plants some orchards, and then he would travel throughout the Northwest Territory, just while the Northwest Indian War is going on, and he really starts doing this just before George Washington becomes president. So he is there at the American founding as they're winning the Northwest Indian War, which was fought over lands of Ohio and Indiana and Indianapolis and that whole region, which many American founders claimed ownership of because they wanted to settle, because so many people were moving there and they wanted to make profit, and much of the profit they wanted to make was farming. And Johnny Appleseed goes to these farmers, he plants apple trees, and he would travel from farm to farm planting the apple trees. Every year, he would come back and prune and take care of the trees. And when the farmers sold the apples, he would come back the following year for his pruning, and he would get paid for his work. John Chapman was a real person and helped found the Northwest Territory. Interestingly, he was also an itinerant preacher, because just about when George Washington becomes president, the Second Great Awakening starts, and a whole bunch of new and interesting religions are developing alongside the revival of the more traditional versions of Christianity in particular. And Catholicism, and we're not going to get too into the religion, but Johnny Appleseed professed Swedenborgianism. The name of the religion that he went around preaching between tree plantings was called Swedenborgianism. Now, this is an extreme oversimplification. Again, any religion deserves a whole video of its own. But Swedenborgianism essentially believed that Jesus Christ was not the Son of God. He was a part of God, and therefore also was God. Therefore, for one to be Christ-like, or to try and imitate Jesus in their own personal life, would make someone one with God, and in their belief, in his estimation, would make you not God, but a part of God. So it's definitely a little bit different than most of the religions we discuss, but really interesting. So he was walking around preaching Swedenborgianism, also called the New Church, but there are some other churches that were called the New Church, so I stick with the European version of it. He would profess Swedenborgianism and plant apple orchards, and yes, he generally walked around barefoot, as we see in the cartoons, and he would wear a pot on his head, as we see in the cartoons. So that's not legend, like, Paul Bunyan, or even Jonathan Moulton. That really happened. He lives into his 80s, and he becomes a legend in his own time, because he would show up every year about the same time in all these different villages all over Ohio and Indiana, parts of Canada, and people expected him, and it was a big exciting thing when this barefoot pot-wearing preacher would show up talking about Swedenborgianism and pruning trees. And he actually plants trees through the first 10 presidential administrations, from Washington to Adams to Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, another Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Tippecanoe, Tyler II, and James Polk. He is planting trees, helping to grow the Northwest Territory, helping to expand America. And as crazy as it is when I say, yeah, Johnny Appleseed was an American founder, it is, from my estimation, empirically true. And I hope you agree with me. If not, that's absolutely fine. But I hope I've sold you on Johnny Appleseed, aka John Chapman, who was a real person who really wore a pot in his head. And that's the briefest life of him I could possibly give you. But we're moving right along because, again, we got some extra founders this week. I'm drinking coffee late because I got work to do after this. So forgive me for chugging in your ears, but I need some wake-up juice. Thomas Mifflin. Thomas Mifflin is one of those gigantic Pennsylvania founders who unfortunately doesn't get a lot of notoriety. Gotta fix my back brace here. Keep my posture or I'll get a neck ache. I do want to note that someone wrote to me in my article and video this week. I did not mention the Conway Cabal. I briefly mentioned it earlier today. I am going to discuss it here now because I was rightly accused of omitting it. And I forget the name of the person who said it, but they said they don't care for him because he was a part of the Conway Cabal, and I should have brought that up because it could affect your opinion of this person. First of all, he is a favorite son of Pennsylvania. So if you've ever watched the TV show The Office, you may know that it takes place in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the company that they work for in The Office is Dunder Mifflin. And my understanding is they very consciously, Dunder is a made-up name, but Mifflin is named after Thomas Mifflin. It's an homage to this particular American founder, which is one of the many great Scranton jokes you get in The Office. Hashtag not sponsored by a show that ended 15 years ago. So Mifflin is important to the Revolution from the beginning. He is an original member of the First Continental Congress. He signs the Articles of Association. After the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he is asked by George Washington in Philadelphia almost as soon as Washington is appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He turns to Mifflin and says, "Will you be one of my aide-de-camp?" And he does this, and he assists Washington. He goes with him to Boston, assists him right at the beginning of the war. But that following summer, 1775, once things are getting organized and they're actually building this army, he is appointed as the first quartermaster general in American history. And as we've discussed before, quartermaster general, he's in charge of everything when it comes to feeding, clothing, keeping alive these thousands of soldiers in the Continental Army. He does this for about 2.5 years. Eventually, he is promoted to Major General, thanks mostly to his service in the New Jersey campaign. But as with everyone who holds really any position of this nature, eventually he is accused of corruption because the Continental Army was a bunch of little cat fighters. Politics has always been kind of crappy, and that was no different during the Revolutionary War. He is accused of selling some of the goods for the Continental Army for his own gain. He is given a court-martial, which he requests. They give it to him, and he is absolved of all wrongdoing. This smacks very close to what happens with Benedict Arnold a few years later. Although Arnold did sell the things, but again, that wasn't necessarily wrong at the time, but I'm not going to start defending Benedict Arnold right now. We're talking about Thomas Mifflin. So Mifflin leaves, and this is the part I omitted. I did talk about how he was appointed to the Board of War. He goes back to the Continental Congress, but the Board of War makes changes, and they end up going from, as I said earlier, from members of the Continental Congress to the words are private citizens. And Mifflin, at this point, he goes to the Continental Congress, but then he leaves, and he is able to finagle his way onto the Board of War. And because of this, he is associated with Horatio Gates, who is president of the Board of War. And there is the Conway Cabal, which Thomas Conway kind of starts recommending that maybe George Washington should be replaced. I will remind you that at this point, George Washington has lost a lot more battles than he's won. Meanwhile, Horatio Gates, although Benedict Arnold was the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates has earned himself the nickname Hero of Saratoga because after Saratoga, he sent his aide, James Wilkinson, another snake who we're not talking about today, but would end up working for the Spanish despite being the senior officer of the United States Army during the John Adams, Thomas Jefferson administration. He sends his slippery friend, Wilkinson, first to tell Congress that he, not Mifflin, but Horatio Gates was the hero of Saratoga. So there were some people who thought maybe Horatio Gates should take over this army. Mifflin seems to have been one of these people. Now, because the Board of War is just a small handful of people, Mifflin and Gates get together and start talking about how do we do this. Now, very quickly, a letter is intercepted. The sender eludes me right now, but a letter is intercepted. I believe it was a Thomas Conway letter, and that's why it's called the Conway Cabal. Um, the letter's intercepted. It goes to Washington. Washington reads it and confronts everyone on it. Everyone very quickly backpedals, and the Cabal is kaput because they quickly realize that, oh, it's really only about 4 or 5 people who want Washington replaced. Usually when you hear the Conway Cabal, we think of it as this giant conspiracy with which people did at the time think it was a giant conspiracy. It turned out not to be, which is why it was so easily smothered by Washington and Washington's friends. Thomas Conway gets shot in the face by John Cadwalader in a duel, who stands over his body and says, I have stopped that damn rascal's lying. And Mifflin's reputation actually seems to be pretty clear here. It's unclear to me whether or not Washington and everyone else knew the level of his involvement, but he does very quickly say, no, we're cool, George, we're cool. By November of 1783, just as the Revolutionary War is officially concluding, right after it's about the time the Treaty of Paris arrives in the United States, he is elected to the Continental Congress, and then he is actually named, as it says next to me, a president of the Continental Congress. Now, while here, several notable things happen. First of all, on December 23rd, 1783, George Washington shows up to the Continental Congress to resign his commission. The war is over. The army is being decommissioned, and George Washington, after 8 years of war, wants to go home and celebrate Christmas with his wife. And to resign that commission, the president of the Continental Congress, as we've discussed, is a ceremonial position. It doesn't mean much, except you get to sign the cool stuff. You oversee the discussion. You're not a president of the United States. You're chairman of the Continental Congress. You make sure everyone gets a turn to talk and no one's fighting. And when letters go out, you're the official signer. And when George Washington shows up to resign his commission, you're the one he hands it to. So, despite the Conway Cabal 4 years earlier, Thomas Mifflin is the one George Washington resigns to. As I said, the Treaty of Paris had arrived, but one of the flaws of the Articles of Confederation is that they just couldn't get anything done because they couldn't get anyone to show up. At this time, the separate states were separate nations, and the Continental Congress was more like being an ambassador than going to the federal government. And it was a job, it was a stepping stone job that kids would do. That's why Hamilton does it as a young man. That's why Madison does it as a young man, because they were making their way up in their own state governments, and this was like a nice resume builder. Mifflin there as president, it was easy as a Philadelphia resident. Although I do believe they were in Baltimore at this time. Still, Mid-Atlantic. Mifflin is the one who's trying to get everyone to show up to ratify the treaty to end this war already. And finally he does. And when Richard Beresford shows up, who's kind of a nobody, his claim to fame is he was the guy who showed up and made a quorum so they could ratify the treaty. He shows up and the treaty is ratified. And who gets to sign it on behalf of the United States? Thomas Mifflin. Now, again, it had already been signed. The real one was signed by Franklin and Adams and John Jay over in Europe. But Thomas Mifflin signs the letter of acceptance, sends it back, and the war is over. Mifflin, as I said, he is a humongous founder because he ends up going to the Constitutional Convention, where he is one of the, as the Federal Farmer put it, people who were, I'm going to pull up the quote because I don't want to say it wrong. He is one of the men who were appointed principally, who were esteemed aristocratical. So Mifflin goes and he helps author the Constitution, and he signs the United States Constitution. Really big deal. Again, in the same room as that same George Washington, which is one of the reasons I kind of skipped the Conway Cabal thing, because of all the people associated with the Conway Cabal, I mean, he goes on to work with George Washington quite a bit, writing the Constitution and such. After the Constitutional Convention, he's elected president of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a first constitution. We discussed Massachusetts writing their first constitution. Pennsylvania's first constitution after independence was really strange. It was one unicameral legislature, and then there was an Supreme Executive Council. Sometimes you hear people say today that, having one president is tough. There should be like 3 presidents or a board or something. So Pennsylvania tried that, and it didn't go very well because there was a lot of arguing. And when you have an executive, you need someone to take the lead. And if you don't have that set leader, it's difficult. Pennsylvania had an executive council, which had a president of the council, which was similar to the Continental Congress, where it was a chairman of the executive council. By 1790, Pennsylvania is like, all right, we've really screwed this up. This is not working. They write a second constitution already. He is president of the executive council, as this is written. And then when they put in the new constitution and vote for governor, Thomas Mifflin becomes the first governor of Pennsylvania. Now, again, there were already presidents of Pennsylvania, though usually they're not really, I would count them as governors, but they're often not counted as governor. And he is usually given credit as the first governor of Pennsylvania. And he holds the position throughout the 1790s, through the George Washington into the John Adams administration. He resigns the position, or he doesn't go back for re-election in 1799, and then passes away about a month after he leaves office. So just in time. That's Thomas Mifflin in a mouthful. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely hit like. That'd be great. We're gonna bounce over here. What we got left? We got a whole bunch of dudes left. Okay. Again, it's 2 weeks we're covering, so I'm gonna take another sip of this coffee. Talk about Richard Bassett. Most of the rest of this discussion, these guys go pretty quick. They don't have nearly as much. They're not Thomas Mifflins, that's for sure. So Richard Bassett is a lawyer in Pennsylvania. Lawyer in Delaware. After independence, he was a pretty conservative guy, didn't really promote independence, but once it happened, he is a member of the Assembly in Delaware, and he spends most of his time, that first 10 years or so after independence, in Delaware. He does spend a little bit of time in the Continental Congress, but most of the time he's in the state. He helps write the first constitution, again, for Delaware. He helps do a whole bunch of stuff at the state level. He's really well known for raising money for the militia. By 1787, he'd become so important to Delaware that when the Constitutional Convention was called, they decided to send Richard Bassett as one of their representatives. He is there the entire summer. He's one of the few people who shows up almost every single day. And he's also one of the only people who gives 0 speeches. He's just happy to be there, apparently. He does work in committee. He does have a small influence on the Constitution, but generally, he just sees what's going on, nods his head in approval, listens intently, and then signs the United States Constitution. Pretty sweet. What's really interesting, as it says next to me about Bassett, is when he is, after this, elected an inaugural member of the United States Senate. Again, there are only 13 states, so there are 26 people who were in the first United States Senate. Now, it can't be called to order until they have a quorum. Once they get a quorum, everyone's not there yet, but they need to elect a senior member of the Senate. Now, nowadays, the senior member of the Senate is the person who's been there longest in the majority party. But on day one, everyone had been there for 1 day. There was no one. No one had been there longer. There also weren't any parties. There were loosely affiliated pro and anti-administration parties, but this is before Washington even showed up. So there was no administration. There was literally nothing. There was nothing to go on. So what did they do? Well, what you would do in kindergarten. They went alphabetically. And Richard Bassett with a B.A. was first. And he became the senior member of the United States Senate. Theoretically, if he were to be brought back to life right now, spoiler alert, this is 200 years ago, he's passed away since. If he were to be brought back to life and sent to the United Senate, right now, he would be the senior member of the United States Senate. He will always be the senior member of the United States Senate. Why? Alphabet. That's Richard Bassett. Now, I should note, he ends up going to be a Chief Justice in Delaware of the Court of Common Pleas, which is one of the many courts in the court system. And he ends up becoming governor of Delaware. And then he ends up, when John Adams appoints those midnight judges just before Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Richard Bassett is appointed as one of those midnight judges. He is, I believe, United States Circuit Court for the Third Circuit, which is like the Delaware region. So, Richard Bassett. Let's move right along. Let's see what else we got here. Alexander Scammel. Oh man, yeah, and we got some fun ones these last few weeks. Executing Andre. So real quick, Alexander Scammel is from New Hampshire. When New Hampshire starts Revolutionary Warring, or just before the war, there's the Battle of Fort William and Mary. One of Paul Revere's first rides, Paul Revere rides to New Hampshire, tells Portsmouth, hey, the British are coming for your gunpowder. This time they didn't come in force, but the people of New Hampshire Portsmouth went across the water and had a small battle for the fort. There were only a handful of soldiers there, one officer. There was some violence, some punching and kicking, but no one was killed or seriously wounded. But they did take gunpowder, and then the next day, some cannons from Fort William and Mary in case a war broke out. This is in December of 1774, so just a few months before Lexington and Concord, and very much the same thing that happens at Lexington and Concord, except this one doesn't lead to a war for some reason. Now, Scammel was there. He was working with his mentor, John Sullivan, who becomes a very important major general in the Continental Army. Now, when the war breaks out, Scammel joins the war, joins the Continental Army. He participates in just a whole slew of battles in the north. He makes his way up to adjutant general. Now, adjutant general is a hard position to explain. It's kind of like human resources in an army. And he does this, and he does this very well. I put in my article, he's the CEO of the company, although I guess Washington would be. So that's not the best analogy, but it's the business of running an army. And he does it very, very well. He replaces Timothy Pickering when Pickering moves up to quartermaster general. And most notably for a Scammel in his career and in this time is when Benedict Arnold is found to be a traitor, he is communicating with the British Major John Andre. And John Andre has become famous through stories and lore. There's all sorts of shows about Benedict Arnold and his treason that we've seen on TV, including Turn has become famous very recently. And John Andre is hung for his crime as a spy. But what's overlooked is that the person charged with executing Andre is Alexander Scammel. I have a fun line here. On the morning of Andre's execution, Scammel writes a note that says, Sir, His Excellency General Washington has fixed the hour at 12 o'clock this day. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, Alexander Scammel, Adjutant General. That's it. That's the whole note that Andre gets before he dies. And there's a lot of abbreviations in there. It was very tough for people to see Andre die because Andre was, as you see in the shows, really beloved even by his enemies. He's just a fun guy. He played all sorts of music. He was into poetry. Just a great in conversation. Even going to the gallows was like, what's up, guys? What's going on? And Scammel hangs Andre, and then very shortly thereafter resigns his position. He does stay in the Continental Army. It just seems like this weighed on him a lot, from my perspective. There's not a lot to go on with that, but from what I read about him, it seemed, he resigns very shortly after this, and it seems to weigh on him. But also, like many young men at the time, he wanted to fight, and he does fight. And he goes to the Battle of Yorktown, where the Battle of Yorktown actually takes a few weeks, and during the maneuvers beforehand, Scammel's given a division of men to lead. They're known as Scammel's Light Infantry, and he is told to essentially create a diversion to distract, before he goes to Yorktown, he creates a diversion in Connecticut so that the let me say this right. He pretends to attack the British in New York City so that George Washington can start moving his army south to Yorktown. He does this real quick. He does a good job. The British are distracted. They do try and attack New London, Connecticut, to draw Washington back, but it doesn't work. Scammel then goes down to catch up with the army, and he is told to he goes out on a scouting mission. As I said, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Yorktown is several weeks long, and Scammel is sent out on a scouting mission with many of his men to plan the terrain. Now, during this time, he's separated from his men, and he's seen by the British, and he's shot. And they capture him. Now, he is severely wounded, and the British quickly release him. Because Yorktown is going on, they have things to do. They don't want to have to nurse this guy back to health. They send him back to the Americans, but sadly, he passes away from his wounds on October 6, 1781, which is just 13 days later. Just 13 days, less than 2 weeks before the Revolutionary War ends. He dies, which is very tragic, just like the killing of Andre that he had to do, seems to have been. And there are many founders. I run into the name Alexander Scammel a lot when I'm doing research as the names of children of other founders. He really, I know there was a Wadsworth, I think it was Peleg Wadsworth, so there was Alexander Scammel Wadsworth from the Connecticut Wadsworth family. A lot of Dearborn. Oh, Dearborn, that's it. I think it was Alexander Scammel, Dearborn, just a bunch of them. Just because he was really beloved. And he passed away. Samuel Hogden, Quartermaster General. I'm going to sip some water this time. Getting hot in here. Have to turn off my AC, as I like to tell you guys, before I shoot these. It starts getting hot this deep into the conversation. Especially we just hit an hour. Okay, we're not doing so bad. Okay, so Samuel Hogden. I pronounce it Hogden. Sounds right to me. A lot of D's in that name. Samuel Hogden joined the Continental Army as a young man. He quickly becomes a captain of artillery working under Henry Knox. He then becomes field commissary of military stores. So he is in charge of bringing things to and from the field where the soldiers are to the storehouses where the quartermaster general keeps them. In this position, he works under Timothy Pickering. Eventually, he gets promoted to commissary general of military stores. So instead of field commissary, he's commissary general. So he's in charge of moving the goods. And he works closely with Quartermaster General Timothy Pickering, whose name seems to come up a lot around here nowadays. They become really good friends. He works through the war. After the war, he ends up working with Pickering in land investments and other business enterprises. They become partners, really good friends. He is a kind of a side member of the Essex Junto. He's not from Massachusetts, but he gets along swimmingly with them. I don't believe he's from Massachusetts. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't recall where he's from. I thought he was from New York. Don't quote me on where he's from. Do quote me that he's friends with Timothy Pickering, and he joins the Washington administration. Now, as we said earlier with Benjamin Stoddard, George Washington didn't just create all the cabinet positions we have today. He created a handful. But by the time Washington even becomes president, the Native American War in the Northwest Indian War has been already going on for several years. And they try and fight it, and eventually Washington realizes he needs to make some changes. So he creates the position of Quartermaster General, with Congress's approval, of course, and Samuel Hogden is named as the first Quartermaster General in the United States after the Constitution. I'll remind you, his buddy Pickering had been Quartermaster General, as had Thomas Mifflin, who we discussed before, during the Revolutionary War. But in the United States Army, which was about to be renamed the Legion of the United States and then would be named the United States Army. You have Arthur St. Clair. There's been a bunch of mishaps in the Northwest Indian War. It has not been going very well. And Arthur St. Clair is appointed, another American founder, to take over that war. He had been serving as governor of the territory, and now he's major general in charge of the war. And it's Ogden's job to get from Philadelphia, where the government was now stationed, it was his job to get the goods to the frontier for St. Clair. Now, he doesn't do a fantastic job. First of all, he wants to save a lot of money, which sounds nice. But when you're trying to win a war, sometimes the whole spare no expense thing goes a long way. Additionally, Ogden had never actually been to the West, and he was unfamiliar with the terrain and what it would take to get through some of this uncharted territory. So much of the supplies he sends, the food is good and everything, but a lot of some of the clothing and boots, and specifically the axes and machetes. I don't remember the terminology of the time, but essentially the machetes to cut through the woods to make a trail so they could bring their wagon trains of army supplies were not good enough. And it slowed things down. It hurt the morale of the soldiers. Now, St. Clair would go on to lose, arguably, one of the worst defeats in American history. I believe it's still the worst defeat fighting against Native Americans in American history. And St. Clair gets blamed by the Washington administration because you're in charge. You're supposed to win this war. That's why we put you in charge. St. Clair blames Ogden for all of the reasons I told you. He just sent crappy stuff that couldn't... How are we supposed to win the war with this crap? And that goes well. St. Clair actually calls for an inquiry into Ogden, although that was eventually dropped. He should bear some of the blame. They both should bear some of the blame for it not working out. To be fair, Commander-in-Chief Washington should also bear some of the blame. And we know Washington was a stand-up guy. I mean, I could go on and on about certain reasons why Washington is an exceptional person. I don't like great man history. I don't like to put all my eggs in one basket like that. Historians nowadays generally try and avoid giving credit to one person. And heck, that's kind of the whole point of this channel, is talking about all the other people who aren't George Washington. George Washington was an exceptional human being for several reasons. But he didn't really blame Ogden all that much when he probably should have in this scenario. He did cast the blame on St. Clair, which hurt St. Clair's reputation, because no one really wanted to blame Washington. Even at this point, when there was an anti-administration party starting, they were mostly anti-Hamilton, not so much Mr. President General Washington. Now, to avoid controversy, within the year, Ogden resigns the position of Quartermaster General, because he's pretty much at fault here. And it seems like he realizes that. But Washington really likes this guy, and eventually, a few years later, talks him into returning to the federal government, this time essentially taking up his old position at military stores. This time it's renamed to Superintendent of Military Stores. And he holds this through the John Adams administration as just storing all the goods in case a war breaks out, which a war does. The quasi-war with France does break out. But I should note, the Quartermaster General that Ogden gets, that position is created several years in. I don't remember exactly what year, but after the administration of Washington has begun for a few years. When Thomas Jefferson shows up, unlike Adams, Jefferson cleans house, brings in his own team. Ogden goes on to be extremely wealthy in his private life, and he actually spends time as president of an early insurance company, because that was becoming a thing. They had just created Wall Street and all these banks. Why not create insurance companies too? Thanks, Hamilton. And we'll move on. No politics here. We are going to talk about Donald Campbell, another name who's associated with just a humongous moment in American history that everyone forgets. And I'll tell you after I sip this water. I will tell you. So Donald Campbell, he had come to America as a kid with his dad. His father actually came from Scotland with 83 families who had been promised by the colonial governor of New York a huge grant of land. Now, the governor of New York at the time goes back on his agreement and doesn't give him the land. And Donald's father, and then Donald himself, would spend a giant portion of his life trying to reclaim this land. But Campbell does fight in the French and Indian War with the British Army. But once the Revolutionary War breaks out, yeah, Donald's on board. He's had his grievances with Britain for quite a long time. He ends up being appointed as Deputy Quartermaster General for the Northern Department of the war. Now, this means he is in charge of quartermastering for the invasion of Quebec. Major General Philip Schuyler starts the launch, but he turns around. Brigadier General Richard Montgomery is promoted to Major General and leads the invasion. He gets to Quebec just as Benedict Arnold, American hero, brings his men through the wilderness of Maine. They meet up outside Quebec. They attack Quebec almost immediately. Montgomery shot in the head, dead. Benedict Arnold shot in the leg, I believe was one of his leg injuries, shot and pulled from the field. So all of a sudden, Deputy Quartermaster Campbell finds himself in charge of a battle. And despite his experience at war, he is ill prepared for this particular event. Now, looking at it from his perspective, he sees the two leaders of this army killed instantly, and a little bit of disarray starts happening. He, and I am making a little bit of assumption here on his behalf, but it appears that he sees these men die, everything's starting to go haywire, and his response is, okay, let's retreat so we can get our heads together here. So he immediately calls for a retreat right after the battle starts. Pretty much right when it starts. And they retreat. So he is the one who orders the retreat from Quebec. And then that ends up moving further towards Montreal, where John Thomas is one of the men, as we discussed earlier, who takes over. Smallpox breaks out. Things go really bad. The invasion of Canada went really well at first, and then goes really poorly after that. Campbell, then there were many of the men there thought they could have won that battle and taken Canada. And this leads to a court-martial of Campbell, who is found guilty and cashiered from the army. Now, there is a little bit of back and forth over, it's one of the earliest court-martials of this nature. Eventually, Continental Congress actually reinstates Campbell about a year later. But he declines to join and goes back into private life. He's like, I've done my service here. I watched everyone get their heads blown off. And then goes back to private life. So we are pretty well over an hour, so I'm gonna leave it at that. Campbell is kind of a role player, as is Thomas B. But Thomas B's story is fun too. So Thomas B was from South Carolina. He was a wealthy plantation owner in the South. I don't even really talk about anyone from the South today. Man, a lot of guys in the North the last 2 weeks. Thomas B. He's in the local, the government. By 1779, he makes his way up to Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. Now, this is when the British are coming. They are starting to come into Georgia. Governor John Rutledge goes to lead the men. He is commander-in-chief of the militia of South Carolina, so he goes to lead the men. Thomas B. finds himself at the head of South Carolina's government as the British are coming to invade South Carolina. And he thinks, we need more soldiers. We ain't got nearly enough. And, well, he was right. South Carolina would get seized. And in Charleston, I should say, would get seized. The British do come. It does not go great. He starts a letter writing campaign to a bunch of different Virginians. First of all, he writes to the Continental Congress. He writes to Richard Henry Lee, who is not president of Continental Congress at this point, but one of the ranking members of the Continental Congress, and says, hey, we need help. Lee writes a letter to George Washington and says, hey, Washington, they need help. Washington writes back to Lee and to B and says, no. You and what army? Like, I don't have enough men over here. In fact, I have a quote here. Quote, Washington says, quote, I am at a loss at what additional measures to advise. Troops from this army cannot possibly send for the reasons repeatedly assigned. Washington basically saying, I keep telling you I need more soldiers. You want me to give up more soldiers? Do you know who I am? I'm George Washington. So Thomas B. Does something else. He writes to another Virginian, Patrick Henry, who was governor of Virginia at the time. He writes to Patrick Henry, hey man, I know you love America. I know under the Articles of Confederation we are separate countries and you don't have to help South Carolina. But, if they take South Carolina, they're probably going to take Virginia. And, he's just really appealing to the patriotism. Come on, bud. Let's do this. That letter does not make it to Patrick Henry. That letter is intercepted by the British. And that letter is published in a New York newspaper to make South Carolina look weak, to make the Continental Army look weak, to make the Americans look weak, and to make it look like you could very easily take Charleston, South Carolina. Again, a few months later, the British would do this. It wasn't super easy, but it was easy enough that they did it. Now, that was a pretty stressful year for Thomas B. as a governor of South Carolina. He ends up, after that, being sent to the Continental Congress as a delegate, though doesn't really do a ton over there, just kind of hangs out during a time where they couldn't seem to get a quorum together and do anything. He does focus on foreign affairs, and he does find himself helping solve the problems with the two ministers in France, Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, which is a huge story on its own. And it's interesting. I read about he was dealing with taxation for foreigners living in the United States, which was difficult to figure out. And I'm not going to get too into it, but he helped settle the disputes regarding how do we tax Frenchmen who are living in the United States. And then later on, just like, who did we discuss this before? It wasn't Stoddard. Was it Stoddard? We were talking about a midnight judge before. And, well, Thomas B., John Adams, appointing midnight judges before Tommy Jeff takes over. And Thomas B. is appointed as a midnight judge, chief judge of the 5th Circuit Court, which he remains into through the Jefferson administration for 12 years, actually. Seemingly does a good job, because if Thomas Jefferson isn't getting rid of you, he did a good job. You know what? And what's funny about the B family that I read a little bit on, didn't get too deep on, but they end up becoming really important to Texas. One of his sons, I believe it was, might have been one of his sons goes out to Texas and is part of the group that helps Texas leave Mexico and become the Republic of Texas, which it is for 12 years or so, and then would be influential. His son would be influential in making Texas a state in the United States, and then his grandsons would be important to the Civil War. They would be generals for the Confederates in the Civil War. So the B family ends up being really important to Texas, and again, that just shows how the American founders. We often think of the East Coast, and it was primarily the East Coast, but they pretty directly affect the growth of the United States over the next century or so. It's the B family. And I guess we're done here. Thank you guys for joining me. We ran a little bit long. We're hour 20. Okay, an extra 20 minutes. For an extra 6 founders, that's not so bad. You guys didn't ask a ton of questions. That's okay. I'm happy to just sit here and talk. Thank you guys for watching. Popping in when you can. If you haven't hit like on your way out, if you want to hit like, that's amazing. We are going to do trivia tomorrow. I am going to do something on 4th of July. Probably quick. I'll probably do a quick live video or a live quick video on the 4th of July. I'm not entirely sure what I'll do, but it'll be fun. TJ. I'm a night person. It's actually not past my bedtime. If I didn't have kids, I'd just wake up before I did this video. No, that's only half a joke. No, it is not. I actually am going to go do a little bit of work, do some more videos and articles for the upcoming week for you to enjoy. So, thank you so much for watching. Again, I am now publishing a video and an article about the same founder every morning. This used to just be a review of the articles I published, and my videos were kind of random. Now I'm doing them at the same time. So if you watch the more brief videos in the morning each week, this will be a wrap-up. So if you see a video and you have a question, either write it down or leave a comment on the video. I'll write it down, or you can tweet me, or Instagram, Facebook, whatever. I'll save the questions for when we come up this week. Like I said, someone had called me out on Thomas Mifflin, so I discussed that. I'm happy to answer anything I can, help you guys learn, because you know this is essentially me learning, and I'm telling you what I learned. So come learn with me. Thank you guys so much. It's been 2 weeks since I've did this, but I know we end with round bottom, so I will give you guys a round bottom, and I'll see you guys for trivia tomorrow.